Harold notices unfamiliar glints from across his fence. New security cameras installed by the HOA pointed directly at his backyard. The late afternoon sun bathed Maplewood Springs in that lazy, golden light that only September seemed to bring. It slanted low across Harold Bennett's small vegetable garden, setting the ripening tomatoes aglow and stretching long shadows from the rows of squash and corn. Harold wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, feeling the familiar grit of dirt and sweat, and leaned on his spade, savoring the fading warmth. That's when he saw it. Tiny flashes of reflected light coming from across the old cedar fence his father had built decades ago. Squinting, he set his spade aside and walked slowly to the edge of the garden. There, perched high on the HOA's utility poles, were two black-domed security cameras, their glassy lenses tilted unmistakably toward his backyard. He felt a ripple of something sour stir in his gut. This backyard wasn't just a patch of land. It was where Margaret had planted daisies in old tin wash basins, where Sunday afternoons had been spent shelling peas and sipping sweet tea. It was where she once said, half joking, half pleading, "This backyard is ours. Harold, keep it safe." Harold rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Cameras pointed directly here, without so much as a word of warning. It didn't sit right. Not in a town like Maplewood Springs, where trust had always been a handshake and a neighbor's word was better than a notarized letter. Leaving his tools leaning against the weathered shed, Harold changed into a clean shirt, ran a comb through his silver hair, and made his way to the HOA office. The old library building had been converted years ago into a place where Brenda Caldwell and her small cadre of board members ruled over the neighborhood with growing authority. Brenda greeted him from behind her oversized mahogany desk, her teeth bared in a smile too polished to reach her eyes. Harold tipped his cap politely, but got straight to the point. "I noticed the new cameras," he said, voice steady. "Mind telling me why one's pointed straight into my backyard?" Brenda's smile widened. "Security upgrades, Mr. Bennett. Nothing personal, just for everyone's safety." "You understand, I'm sure?" Harold's brows knit together. "Safety's one thing, invading privacy's another." She laughed a tight, brittle sound. "Standard angles approved at the last meeting." She shuffled a stack of papers, meaningfully dismissing him without quite saying the words. Harold stood for a long moment, his knuckles whitening on the brim of his cap, before giving her a stiff nod and stepping back into the warm Tennessee evening. As he crossed the street toward the diner, Ellie Fisher waved him over from her porch swing. Her short, white curls caught the last rays of the sun, and a half-empty mason jar of sweet tea sweated on the table beside her. "Spotted your visitors, didn't you?" she said, patting the swing beside her. Harold sat down heavily, the swing creaking under his weight. "Didn't think I'd have to start charging admission to watch me water the squash." Ellie chuckled, but her face turned serious. "They're watching, all of us, Harold. And it's not about safety." He sat quietly for a while, the cicadas sawing their endless song into the thick evening air. Maplewood Springs had changed little by little, letter by letter, camera by camera. The next morning, Harold decided he wasn't going to take this lying down. He set out his old rocking chair near the back fence, carefully angled toward the cameras, and spent the better part of the day there sipping sweet tea, reading the paper and occasionally tipping his hat toward the black domes. By sunset, he found a notice stuffed in his mailbox. Violation unauthorized structures on his property. Subject to fine. He held the letter up to the fading light and shook his head. They were grasping petty dangerous, down at the diner over a dinner of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Harold sat quietly soaking in the easy flow of conversation from the regulars. Charlie Whitaker wandered in fresh from court and tipped his hat to Harold before settling into the booth across from him. "You look like a man with something on his mind," Charlie said, pulling a menu toward him. Harold slid the notice across the table. "Reckon it's about time someone did something." Charlie scanned the paper and let out a low whistle. "You reckon right. When Harold got home that night, he didn't bother turning on the porch light. Instead, he moved carefully through the dark, setting up an old handheld camera on the edge of the garden. He aimed it at the new surveillance gear, making sure to capture the slow mechanical tilt as the cameras shifted, following even the slightest movement in his yard. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show intent, more than enough to raise questions in any courtroom or newspaper office worth its salt. Days passed. Harold noticed more changes. Mr. Thompson down the road suddenly had to repaint his mailbox. Mrs. Garcia was cited for non-compliant lawn ornaments, a pair of ceramic gnomes that had sat harmlessly by her porch for 20 years. The quiet anger of the town simmered just beneath the surface. Ellie mentioned neighbors whispering over fences, shaking their heads. Brenda and her board had gone too far, but fear still kept most mouths shut. Harold wasn't much of a fighter, never had been. But there was something about a man's home, his patch of ground, the memories layered thick as autumn leaves, that wasn't up for negotiation. And if he had to stand alone to defend it, well, Margaret would expect no less. Standing under the twilight, Harold says to himself, they forgot whose land this is. A formal violation notice arrives. Harold is fined for a non-conforming birdhouse, a small wooden one he had built for Margaret years ago. The notice arrived on a Thursday, tucked neatly between a grocery flyer and a bill from the electric company. Harold found it while sipping his morning coffee on the porch, the smell of fresh-cut grass hanging in the cool September air. He pulled the envelope open and frowned as the stiff letter slid free. Official HOA letterhead, sharp black ink, and cold, bureaucratic language greeted him. Violation non-conforming structure. Fine, $200. Offense. Unauthorized birdhouse. He read it again to be sure, but the words didn't change. It was the small wooden birdhouse Margaret had painted herself a little crooked from years of Tennessee rain, perched atop a weathered post by the garden gate. Harold ran a calloused hand down his face and sighed. There it was. Proof they weren't just watching. They were hunting. After folding the notice carefully and sliding it into his shirt pocket, Harold walked out to the garden. The cicadas buzzed lazily in the still air. That birdhouse had stood there longer than most of the new homes in Maplewood Springs. Margaret used to leave bits of yarn and twine near it, smiling whenever she saw the sparrows dart in and out. The memory settled heavily on his chest. Later that afternoon, he crossed town to the HOA office. The building, once warm and welcoming, now felt sterile under the hum of fluorescent lights. Brenda Caldwell sat behind the same heavy desk, her blouse crisp, her lipstick perfect. "I'm here about this notice," Harold said, laying the letter neatly before her. Brenda didn't even pretend to read it. She clasped her hands primly and smiled with all the sincerity of a tax collector. "Non-conforming structure," she said. "Regulations require all decorative items to be pre-approved. Yours wasn't. It's a birdhouse. Brenda, been there for years," Harold said, his voice even but firm. "Unapproved structures, lower property values, Mr. Bennett. We have to be consistent." Harold opened his mouth, then shut it. There was no reasoning with someone who treated a hand-painted birdhouse like a criminal offense. He left without another word. The Maplewood Springs diner was already filling up for the early supper crowd when Harold pushed through the door, the familiar tinkle of the bell overhead momentarily cutting through the low hum of conversation. The smell of frying bacon and fresh-baked pies wrapped around him like an old blanket. Ellie Fisher was perched in her usual corner booth, a cup of coffee steaming in front of her. She waved him over with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Looks like you got one too," she said, tapping a similar notice on the table. Her offense: an unauthorized lawn ornament, a ceramic frog no bigger than her purse. Harold slid into the booth with a tired grunt. He flagged down Mavis, the waitress, for a black coffee refill. "They're going through the neighborhood like a tornado," Harold said. Ellie chuckled, picking up her mug. "Once they start counting your garden gnomes, you know you're in trouble." Harold managed a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mavis brought fresh coffee without being asked, topping off both their mugs with practiced ease. Across the diner, retirees discussed fishing tournaments and the upcoming harvest festival. A young father bounced a toddler on his knee while chatting with the old-timers at the counter. Life went on stubborn and sweet. Harold and Ellie leaned in, speaking low. "They're trying to push people out," Harold said. "Anyone who doesn't fit their idea of perfect." "You're not wrong," Ellie said. She nodded toward the window where the HOA office loomed across the street. "And it's not just you. Mrs. Garcia got fined for hanging her autumn wreath too early." Harold sipped his coffee, thinking. Fear was a funny thing. It kept people quiet, compliant, but it also built pressure, slow and steady. Just as he was mulling this over, the bell above the door jingled again. In strolled Charles. Charlie Whitaker, Harold's old fishing buddy turned local property lawyer. He spotted them immediately and made his way over a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "You two look like you've seen ghosts," Charlie said, sliding into the booth. Harold pulled the violation notice from his pocket and slid it across the table without a word. Charlie read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line. "Well, well," he said, sitting back. "They're getting bolder. They're counting bird houses and gnomes now," Ellie said dryly. Charlie rubbed his chin. "You know, Harold, Tennessee has pretty strong privacy laws when it comes to private property. Those cameras, the notices, might not be as airtight as Brenda thinks." Harold leaned forward. "What are you saying, I'm saying?" "If you're willing," Charlie said with a slow smile, "we can start drafting a formal inquiry. Make them answer for every eye they've set on you without your consent." The idea took root quickly like a seed dropped into fertile soil. Harold wasn't a man to seek out trouble, but he wasn't about to roll over either, especially not when it came to Margaret's birdhouse. The three of them spent the next hour bent over the table scribbling notes on napkins. Between sips of strong coffee, Mavis slid a slice of peach pie onto the table with a wink, fueling their planning session. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, bathing the sidewalks in soft pools of light. The town moved at its slow, steady pace, but something unseen had shifted. Harold felt it in the air, the way the leaves whispered against each other in the evening breeze. As Ellie drained the last of her coffee, she leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Ellie leans in, whispering, "You're not the only one they've been spying on." Late at night, Harold sets up his own discreet trail cameras to catch HOA's activities in the act. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. Harold moved slowly across his backyard, his old work boots barely making a sound on the dew-slick grass. In one hand, he carried a battered metal toolbox, in the other, a small trail camera barely bigger than his palm. The cameras the HOA had installed still blinked like tiny red eyes high above. Indifferent to the privacy they invaded, Harold worked methodically, setting his first trail camera into the crook of an elm tree near the back gate, carefully angling it to capture anyone who might come poking around. Inside the shed, the scent of oil and old wood wrapped around him like a familiar jacket. The single bulb overhead buzzed softly. Above his workbench, Margaret's photo smiled down at him, her eyes twinkling with that same mischievous spark she'd always worn when planning something clever. Harold allowed himself a small smile in return. He tinkered with the last camera bracket, double-checking the batteries, the memory card, the motion sensor. Old habits died hard. When morning came, Harold moved through town with the quiet purpose of a man on a mission. He stopped by Mr. Thompson's place, first pretending to admire the late summer chrysanthemums while slipping a quiet word into the old man's ear. Then to Mrs. Garcia, handing over a basket of tomatoes with a whispered suggestion to keep an eye on her front porch. Young Jason Adams, barely out of high school, got his assignment in the form of an offer free help tuning his rusty bike. If he noticed anything unusual around town, at Ellie's back porch, Harold found a small assembly already forming. Ellie sat with her ever-present cup of tea, flipping through a worn notebook filled with notes and times and names. Beside her, Mr. Thompson polished his reading glasses with a handkerchief while Mrs. Garcia patted her nervous dog with one hand and scribbled with the other. Jason leaned against the railing, trying to look casual but vibrating with the kind of restless energy only the young possessed. "They've been watching us for weeks," Ellie said, voice low. "Time we started watching back." Harold nodded, pulling out a small folder from under his jacket. Inside were screenshots from his trail cams, grainy images of HOA board members wandering onto properties, clipboard in hand, jotting down infractions that hadn't existed the day before Charlie Whitaker arrived, not long after a stack of manila folders tucked under one arm. He dropped them onto Ellie's table with a satisfying thud. "Found some interesting reading in the bylaws." Charlie said, a sly grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Turns out, HOA installations like cameras need unanimous board approval. Brenda didn't even bother with a vote?" Harold arched an eyebrow. "You're sure this positive?" Charlie said, "Got copies of the minutes from every meeting for the last 2 years. No mention of new surveillance equipment anywhere." Hope stirred among the group like the first warm breeze of spring. Over the next few days, Harold made a ritual of checking his trail cameras just after dawn. He cataloged every suspicious car idling near driveways, every clipboard inspection conducted under the guise of safety, every photograph snapped without permission. At night, he sat at his workbench under Margaret's smiling gaze, logging the footage meticulously into a worn, leather-bound notebook, cross-referencing times and locations, his handwriting slow and careful, filled page after page. He made extra copies of everything, locking them into the old oak desk that had been his father's. One evening, as Harold sorted through the latest batch of images, something caught his eye. A piece of paper clutched in Brenda Caldwell's hand during one of her late-night strolls around the neighborhood. Enlarging the frame, he could just make out the bold header across the top, "Authorization for installation of surveillance equipment." But the most important part was at the bottom. Only Brenda's signature adorned the page. No other board members, no approval stamp, no official seal. Harold sat back, heart thudding gently against his ribs. This was it. Proof that Brenda had gone rogue, operating beyond even the HOA's own strict rules. He printed the image carefully, sliding it into a fresh file folder along with copies of the relevant bylaws and the HOA's own meeting records. As he closed the heavy oak drawer with a firm click, Harold smiled, locking the file into his old oak desk. Let's see how they like being watched for once. Late at night, Harold sets up his own discreet trail cameras to catch HOA's activities in the act. The moon hung low over Maplewood Springs, casting a silver sheen across the rooftops and quiet streets. Harold moved carefully through the shadows, his old boots barely making a sound on the soft grass. In his calloused hands, he carried 2 small trail cameras, gifts from Charlie dug out from the back of his hunting gear. The cameras were no bigger than a deck of cards camouflaged in weathered green plastic. Perfect, Harold thought as he knelt beside the old oak tree at the back of his yard. He fixed the first one high into the branches, angled just right to catch the HOA's utility poles and the black domes that still lurked atop them. A few yards away, he placed the second camera hidden among the thick hedgerow that lined his fence. This one faced the sidewalk, recording anything or anyone that wandered too close. Satisfied, Harold wiped his palms on his jeans and straightened slowly, his knees creaking in protest. Back inside the shed, the warm glow of a single bulb spilled over the familiar clutter of Harold's workbench. Above it, Margaret's photo smiled down at him, her eyes bright with the same mischievous spirit he missed so much. He paused for a moment, tracing the frame's edge with a finger, drawing strength from her silent encouragement. Harold reached for his ledger, a thick, leather-bound notebook he'd used for everything from planting schedules to repair notes. He turned a fresh page and dated it carefully, September 14th, 2024. 24. Beneath it he wrote, "Installed cameras to monitor HOA surveillance activities." He spent the next hour organizing his existing evidence photographs, violation notices, copies of the HOA bylaws Charlie had dug up, and labeling each piece meticulously. The faint sound of cicadas droned outside, blending with the gentle creak of the porch swing as the night deepened. The following morning, Harold made quiet rounds through town. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't confront anyone. Instead, he sipped his coffee slowly at the diner, chatting casually with Mavis about the weather, the fall harvest, and the upcoming town fair. But his eyes noticed everything. The nervous glances, the way some neighbors hunched their shoulders when Brenda's car drove by, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when certain board members entered the room. Ellie Fisher joined him mid-morning, settling into the booth with a soft grunt and a cup of black coffee. "They hit Thompson yesterday," she said without preamble. "Claimed his lawn chairs weren't regulation color." Harold shook his head. "And Mrs. Garcia got a notice about her rose trellis being an unauthorized addition." "You believe that?" He did believe it. The evidence was everywhere, if one cared enough to look. And Harold cared. Later that afternoon, Ellie invited a few trusted neighbors to her back porch under the guise of a casual potluck. There, among plates of potato salad and slices of cherry pie, the real conversations happened quietly, cautiously. Mr. Thompson showed Harold the photo he'd snapped of a man in an HOA badge measuring his front hedge without permission. Mrs. Garcia produced a recording from her doorbell camera capturing Brenda herself, snooping around her porch. Harold listened, nodded, and took careful notes in his ledger. One by one, the pieces came together. Meanwhile, Charlie had been busy too. He called Harold one evening, excitement buzzing in his voice. "Found something," Charlie said. "They're bylaws. They require a full board vote and documented neighborhood approval before installing surveillance equipment. No exceptions. You think they skipped it? Think Harold they didn't even pretend to follow procedure? No meetings, no notices. Brenda signed off herself." Harold sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. It was one thing to bend the rules. It was another to break them so brazenly. That night, under the same quiet moonlight, Harold reviewed the footage from his trail cameras. The grainy images showed HOA inspectors prowling properties without knocking, measuring bushes with rulers, taking photographs without consent. One clip even caught Brenda herself, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes as she peered over backyard fences. But the real prize came tucked among the papers Charlie dropped off the next morning. A copy of an internal memo stamped and signed by Brenda Caldwell, authorizing the installation of surveillance cameras for administrative purposes, without any record of a board vote or public notice. A smoking gun, if Harold had ever seen one. He stared at the memo for a long moment, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Proof, plain and undeniable. Margaret would have been proud. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. Harold moved with quiet purpose, gathering the collected evidence. The photos, the footage, the violation, notices the memo, and tucking them neatly into a battered manila folder. At his workbench, he unlocked the bottom drawer of the old oak desk, slid the file inside, and turned the key with a satisfying click. Harold smiles, locking the file into his old oak desk. Let's see how they like being watched for once. Harold finds a cease and desist letter taped to his front door, unsigned and legally dubious. The morning air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and the distant promise of autumn. Harold opened his front door, half expecting to find the usual newspaper lying crookedly on the porch swing. Instead there, it was an envelope taped right at eye level, flapping gently in the breeze. He peeled it off with a slow, deliberate motion. No return address, no official seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper typed in bold, impersonal font. Cease and desist. Accusations of interfering with HOA operations and unauthorized surveillance activities. No signature, no legal counsel listed, just an empty threat dressed up to look official. Harold's lips thinned into a line. Charlie's voice echoed in his mind. People who know they're wrong often shout the loudest. He folded the paper, neatly slipped it into his back pocket, and took a slow, measured breath. Reckless. Desperate. Brenda Caldwell was starting to panic. Later that afternoon, Harold found himself standing before the HOA notice board on Main Street. A fresh set of violation notices had been pinned up as thick as fallen leaves. Mrs. Garcia's name was there again, this time, fined for excessive seasonal decorations. Jason Adams had received one for unauthorized use of colored lights on his porch. The town was suffocating under petty fines and veiled threats. Harold turned on his heel and made his way toward the diner, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door almost drowned by the murmur of half-whispered conversations. The usual crowd was there, old-timers hunched over their coffees. Ellie perched near the window, Charlie poring over a legal pad. He spotted Brenda immediately seated in the center of the room like a queen in court, sipping tea with a few bored loyalists. Their laughter was brittle, nervous. Harold crossed the room with unhurried steps, every eye tracking him like ripples across a pond. He reached Brenda's table and placed the unsigned cease and desist letter flat before her. "Is this how we do things?" "Now?" he asked quietly. Brenda's smile faltered just for a second. She recovered quickly, brushing non-existent crumbs from her skirt. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Mr. Bennett," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I'm insinuating nothing," Harold replied calmly. "I'm stating it plain. Threats taped to front doors without legal standing aren't how things are done in this town." The diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their forks pausing halfway to their mouths. Brenda's eyes flashed. "If you persist in undermining the HOA's authority, we'll be forced to take legal action." Harold tipped his hat politely. "Then by all means, Brenda. Let's put everything out where folks can see it." Without another word, he turned and walked back to Charlie's booth, leaving a tight, brittle silence behind him. Charlie chuckled low as Harold slid into the seat. "Well, that stirred the pot." "She's slipping," Harold said badly. Charlie tapped the legal pad in front of him, and when people slip, they leave a trail. He pulled a manila folder from his satchel and pushed it across the table. Inside were copies of county codes, excerpts from HOA regulations, and a draft of a formal privacy complaint ready to be filed. "Think it's time to escalate," Charlie said. Harold nodded slowly, the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. He wasn't doing this for himself alone. Ellie, Mrs. Garcia, Mr. Thompson, Jason Adams. They deserved better than to live under fear disguised as governance. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Harold returned home, cleared a space on the old oak desk in his shed, and began laying out the evidence, each violation notice, each photo, each surveillance clip, every memo and email Charlie had managed to dig up. The room smelled of cedar and machine oil of years spent fixing things with his hands. He worked methodically, labeling files with his neat engineer's handwriting. Margaret's photo watched over him from the shelf, her smile a steady comfort. That evening, under the wide Tennessee sky, Harold drove to the county clerk's office. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a battered pickup truck and an old station wagon. Inside the clerk, a kindly woman Harold had known for years, took his complaint without much comment, scanning the attached evidence with furrowed brows. By the time he stepped back into the cool night air, Harold felt lighter somehow, like a man who had planted a seed and knew it would grow given time. The next morning, a new flyer appeared on the HOA notice board, hastily pinned with crooked thumbtacks, "Emergency HOA Meeting. Attendance mandatory." Brenda calls for an emergency HOA meeting. The battle lines are officially drawn. On the eve of the HOA meeting, Harold sits on his porch rereading Margaret's old letters for strength. The porch creaked under Harold's boots as he settled into the old rocker, the last slivers of sunset bleeding across the rooftops of Maplewood Springs. He cradled a worn shoebox on his lap, the lid scuffed and the corners frayed from years of careful handling. Inside were the treasures of another life, Margaret's letters penned in her looping hand on yellowed paper that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. He pulled one free at random, unfolding it with a tenderness that surprised even him. Her words flowed across the page, full of gentle encouragement and small, fierce hopes. "Always stand for what matters. Harold, quiet strength changes more than 100 angry words." The cicadas chirred in the distance, their song swelling and fading with the evening breeze. Harold read until the dusk blurred the words, and then simply sat with the letters resting in his lap, feeling her steadying presence settle over him like a familiar quilt. Lights flickered on one by one along Maplewood's sleepy streets. Harold caught sight of Mr. Thompson walking his old beagle down the sidewalk, giving a small, deliberate nod as he passed. A few minutes later, Garcia appeared at the gate with a covered dish in her hands, a still-warm peach cobbler. "Thought you might need a little something sweet tonight," she said, her smile shy but resolute. Jason Adams stopped by too awkward in his work boots, scratching the back of his neck. He didn't say much, just clapped Harold on the shoulder, the weight of the gesture, speaking volumes. Inside the house, the kitchen table had become Harold's war room. Files were spread out in neat rows, violation notices, photographs, video clips, annotated bylaws. Charlie had spent the afternoon double-checking every detail sitting at Harold's table, with his sleeves rolled up and a fountain pen clutched between his fingers. Ellie arrived as twilight deepened, carrying a small battered thermos filled with fresh coffee. She settled onto the porch swing with a familiar groan of old wood and poured 2 cups, handing one to Harold. "Tomorrow's the day," she said, sipping carefully. Harold nodded, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. The coffee smelled of chicory and something sweet, maybe hope. Ellie leaned her head back against the swing's cushion, looking out over the quiet street. "Folks are tired of feeling small," she said. "You just gave them someone to stand behind." Harold didn't answer right away. He thought of Margaret again, her belief in doing right even when no one was watching. He wasn't seeking applause or confrontation. He just wanted to live with dignity and let others do the same. Charlie appeared at the gate as the evening deepened into night, a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm. He handed it over with a nod. "Everything's in here," Charlie said. "Signed, notarized, ready to present. They can huff and puff all they want this time. You've got the house built out of stone." Harold smiled faintly, tucking the envelope into his battered leather satchel. The old bag had seen years of hard work and quiet battles. It seemed fitting that it should carry this fight too. The hours, stretched thin and quiet, filled with the small, steady tasks of readiness. Harold double-checked his papers, tested his old tape recorder twice, made sure the trail camera footage was queued up neatly. His movements were methodical, measured the slow, certain rhythm of a man who knew the weight of what he carried. Margaret's letters sat stacked neatly on the side table, a silent chorus of encouragement. The town around him settled into sleep, porch lights winked out. Dogs barked once, twice, then fell silent. Somewhere down the street a wind chime sang softly in the breeze. Harold rose from his chair with a soft grunt, stretching the stiffness from his legs. He crossed the porch in 3 slow steps, opened the heavy oak door, and placed the satchel carefully beside the umbrella stand ready for morning. He stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the worn frame, looking out at the quiet world he loved so much. Tomorrow he would step into the meeting hall, not as a man under siege, but as a man carrying truth. As Harold locks the documents in his satchel, he says softly, "Tomorrow we remind them who really owns this town." The community hall is packed, neighbors sitting on folding chairs, standing against walls, all buzzing with rumors. The old Maplewood Springs Community Hall hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Folding chairs lined the center aisle, the wood floors creaking beneath the shuffle of restless feet. The faded American flag in the corner hung limp, the room humming with a low current of whispered speculation. Men in baseball caps leaned against the back wall, arms crossed. Mothers jostled toddlers on their hips. Retirees clutched canvas tote bags on their laps, murmuring to one another in half-hushed tones. Harold stood quietly near the side entrance, the weight of his satchel steady against his shoulder. He could feel the unease in the room, smell it, almost a mixture of coffee, old varnish, and anticipation. Up front, Brenda Caldwell fussed with a neat stack of papers, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She leaned toward her fellow board members, her voice pitched too low for most to hear. But Harold caught enough. "We'll silence him tonight," she said, her smile tight. Yet the cracks were already showing the way. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her jacket. The darting glances she cast toward the growing crowd. The old wall clock struck 7 with a dull clang. Brenda rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped up to the battered podium. "Thank you, residents of Maplewood Springs," she began, her voice dripping the syrupy tone of a practiced politician. "We are gathered tonight to address serious concerns about certain individuals disrupting the harmony of our community." Murmurs rippled through the audience. A few people shifted uneasily. Harold remained where he was, eyes steady. Brenda cleared her throat. In recent weeks, unfounded accusations have been made regarding the operations of your HOA. Tonight, we will clarify these misunderstandings and restore order. She launched into a speech peppered with vague assurances and veiled jabs painting Harold as a troublemaker stirring dissent. Several board members nodded stiffly, but more than a few neighbors exchanged skeptical glances. When she finally gestured toward Harold's section, inviting him to voice his concerns, she did so with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Harold stepped forward with measured calm, his boots sounding steady against the worn floorboards. He placed the satchel on a nearby table and withdrew a neat stack of documents. "I appreciate the opportunity," he said, his voice carrying clear to the rafters. "I'd like to present some facts." He began with the photographs printed in color and large enough for those in the back to see images of HOA enforcers inspecting private backyards without notice. Footage from Harold's trail cameras projected onto a portable screen Charlie had set up. The room quieted. Chairs shifted. Someone coughed nervously. Then came the violation notices handed down for birdhouses, rows, trellises, colored porch lights, each one a reminder of the petty harassment residents had endured. Finally, Harold produced the memo. Brenda's own signature authorizing surveillance installations without proper board approval. Charlie stepped forward, then presenting excerpts from the HOA's bylaws and a letter from the county inspector who had reviewed the evidence and confirmed multiple breaches of privacy law. The shift in the room was palpable. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to full-throated conversations. Neighbors leaned forward, passing documents hand to hand, reading for themselves the proof Harold had laid out. Brenda's posture stiffened. She interrupted twice, only to be met with firm but polite insistence from Charlie, who cited procedural rules, allowing Harold to finish. When Harold finally rested his hand atop the last document, the hall was silent. Ellie rose first, her voice steady. "We trusted you, Brenda, and you used that trust to bully good people." Others followed. Mr. Thompson spoke of the intimidation he felt. Mrs. Garcia tearfully recounted the night she found strangers in her backyard. The momentum built until someone from the back called out, "Vote her out." Brenda tried to rally, tried to reassert control, but her words tangled together, her cheeks flushed, her fingers trembling as she flipped through her notes. A neighbor, Jason Adams, young but clear-eyed, stood and said loudly, "I move that we suspend the current HOA board pending investigation." "I second it," Ellie added immediately. Charlie raised a hand, stepping up beside Harold. "Under Section 8, Paragraph 14 of your own bylaws, a motion and second from members followed by a simple majority is sufficient to call a vote of no confidence." The room erupted, not in chaos but in resolute, organized motion. Hands shot into the air, voices called yes. A handful of board loyalists protested weakly, but they were drowned in a sea of rising determination. Someone grabbed a clipboard. Names were signed. Votes. Tallied. It wasn't close. Brenda stood frozen behind the podium, her face a ghostly mask under the harsh fluorescent lights. Harold watched her, his expression unreadable. He felt no glee, only a deep, steady sense of something. Right being restored. Brenda face, pale mutters under her breath. This isn't over. Harold receives a court summons. Brenda has filed a frivolous lawsuit accusing him of defamation. The envelope arrived without fanfare, dropped by the mail carrier with the day's usual scatter of catalogs and utility bills. Harold pulled it free from the pile and frowned at the stiff, formal weight of it. His name was printed in bold, the return address stamped from the county courthouse, opening it with the same care he would give a delicate seedling. He unfolded the summons. Brenda Caldwell, Harold Bennett charge, defamation of character. He read it twice, then let out a long, slow breath. No surprise, really. Charlie's voice floated back to him from one of their long evenings on the porch. When bullies lose the crowd, they turn to courts. But truth still wins there, too. Harold set the letter down on the kitchen table beside Margaret's old ceramic sugar jar. He didn't slam his fist or curse. He simply poured himself a second cup of coffee, black and steadying, and pulled the phone from its cradle. Charlie answered on the second ring. After a brief exchange, Harold hung up, feeling lighter somehow, the burden shared. They would face this the way they'd faced everything else, head-on, with dignity intact. The county courthouse was a modest brick building with cracked steps and a creaky front door that stuck in humid weather. Inside, the floors were polished to a dull shine, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of long-retired judges. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. On the day of the hearing, Harold wore his Sunday best pressed khakis. A clean white shirt and the navy jacket Margaret had picked out for him years ago. He walked into the room with his head high, the satchel containing his evidence swinging lightly at his side. The room wasn't packed like the community hall had been, but there were a fair number of familiar faces in the wooden pews. Ellie was there knitting calmly in the second row. Mr. Thompson sat with his arms folded, a stoic presence. Even young Jason Adams had shown up cap in hand, shifting nervously but determined to be present. At the front, Brenda sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, her smile brittle. She wore a dark suit that seemed a size too large, and a stack of papers lay neatly in front of her like shields in battle. The judge, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, entered briskly and called the session to order. Brenda's opening statements were long and theatrical. She painted Harold as a rabble-rouser, accusing him of slander, of destabilizing the peaceful order of Maplewood Springs. Her voice trembled not with passion, but with the effort of spinning grievances into something grander than they were. Harold sat quietly, hands folded, watching without anger. When it was Charlie's turn, he rose without notes, without fanfare. He spoke plainly, laying out the timeline with the calm authority of a man stating the obvious. He produced the HOA bylaws, the unsigned memos, the footage, the county inspector's letter confirming procedural violations, point by point. Charlie dismantled Brenda's claims, each fact fitting neatly into place like stones in a well-built wall. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, tapping a pencil lightly against her notepad. When Charlie finished, there was a moment of silence so complete it seemed the whole room held its breath. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Caldwell," she said crisply, "this court finds no merit in your accusations. Furthermore, it appears you engaged in activities that directly violated the privacy rights of residents under your governance." Brenda's mouth opened, then closed again. The gavel came down with a firm, final rap. Case dismissed. A few murmured cheers rippled through the courtroom before quickly fading into respectful silence. The judge wasn't finished. "I caution the plaintiff," she added sternly, "against further misuse of this court's resources. Legal processes exist to serve justice, not to settle personal grudges." Brenda's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, her hands clenching into small fists on the tabletop. Harold gathered his satchel, and nodded politely to the bench before turning to leave. No victory dance. No crowing. Just a man reclaiming his rightful peace. The wooden doors swung open and Harold stepped out into the sunlight. As Harold steps outside the courthouse, neighbors are waiting for him, some with handshakes, some with pies. Ellie says, "We're ready for a new beginning." At sunrise, Harold hammers a small wooden sign into the ground. Private property. Respect, always welcome. The early light spilled like honey over Maplewood Springs, drenching the town in a gentle gold. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the morning air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and ripening apples. Harold bent over, carefully hammering the last nail into the small post he had sunk just inside his garden fence. The sign, handmade and neatly painted, swayed slightly as he tapped it into place. Private property respect. Always welcome. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, and stepped back to admire the simple message. Not a warning, not a threat, just a reminder of what mattered. Margaret's words drifted through his mind as steady as the sunrise. A good fence, a strong heart, and kind neighbors, that's all a man needs. The weeks after the courthouse victory passed like a breath of fresh air through Maplewood Springs. The cameras came down, first, removed quietly, almost sheepishly by the newly appointed interim HOA council. No ceremony, no speeches, just the sound of metal loosening and the soft thud of control relinquished. The residents gathered at the community hall once more, this time to vote in a smaller neighbor-led council. Ellie took a seat at the table along with Jason Adams, Mrs. Garcia, and two others, known more for their casseroles and garden advice than for heavy-handed rulemaking. Charles Whitaker agreed to serve temporarily as legal advisor, ensuring any new rules stayed firmly within the bounds of common sense and common courtesy that Saturday. To celebrate, the town hosted a barbecue out in the grassy field behind the diner. Folding tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, cornbread brisket, peach pies, baked beans with thick slices of bacon. Children raced between the trees, shrieking with delight as they chased each other with sticks and worn-out baseball gloves. Harold arrived carrying a small toolbox and a bundle of cedar planks tucked under his arm. A group of children, curious as ever, clustered around him as he sat up near the old oak tree. "Gonna teach you kids something worth knowing?" Harold said, his voice warm. "How to build a birdhouse that'll stand longer than the latest rules. Someone tries to hang over you." The children gathered close, little hands reaching for nails and pieces of sandpaper. Ellie perched nearby with a mug of coffee, laughing as one boy stubbornly insisted on painting his birdhouse bright blue, even as Harold tried to explain the benefits of blending in with the trees. As the afternoon wore on, plates emptied and laughter thickened. Mrs. Garcia played an old radio tuned low to a country station, and the sound drifted lazily over the field. Later, when the sun dipped low and the sky blushed pink at the edges, Ellie called for attention. She climbed onto a small bench and raised her glass of sweet tea high. "I think it's about time we thank the man who reminded us what community really means," she said, her voice strong despite the lump forming in her throat. She turned to Harold, who stood modestly to the side, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Harold Bennett," she said, "for your quiet courage, your stubborn kindness, and for showing us that fences aren't meant to keep good folks out. They're meant to remind us where we belong." The cheer that went up from the crowd was honest and hearty, echoing into the first stars just beginning to prick the darkening sky. Harold tipped his hat with a sheepish smile and a soft murmur of thanks, feeling something loosen and settle inside him, something that had been clenched tight for too long. As the night deepened and lanterns swung from tree branches, the children released handfuls of fireflies into the air, their laughter rising in bright bursts as the tiny lights winked and bobbed over the field. Harold wandered back to his porch, the weight of the satchel long gone, replaced by a lighter burden, a responsibility shared, a home reclaimed. He settled into the old swing, its familiar creak greeting him like an old friend, the cool wood pressed comfortably against his back. He rocked gently, watching the kids run through the twilight, their shrieks and giggles drifting on the sweet-smelling breeze. The stars multiplied, blinking into existence one by one as the fireflies danced below them. Still home, still free. As the stars shimmered above Maplewood Springs and laughter echoed through the autumn air, Harold's small wooden sign stood quietly, a simple promise kept. The battle for dignity hadn't been loud or fierce, but it had been steady, and it reminded everyone that strength often wears the face of kindness. When communities stand firm against misused power, they don't just reclaim their rights, they rediscover each other, like a weathered fence guarding a beloved garden. Quiet courage protects what matters most. Perhaps, somewhere near or far, it's time for more good neighbors to stand together.